Greetings and welcome back. I want to get back to that notion of class that I was talking about in the last mini lecture and talked about class being a person's relative position. And again, relative position can be objectively. For example, is a person in terms of income level upper class, middle class, lower class, and of course, people define those terms differently. But certainly there's a qualitative difference between somebody making $1 million a year and someone making $50,000 a year. The subjective element, which is more psychological, is much more difficult. So, are we talking about, uh, how a person defines themselves? Where would a person place themselves? And I told you about that crazy party I went to in Piedmont where we had a bunch of people who obviously are very, very wealthy, and yet they saw themselves as average middle class people, and some mythical rich people were screwing them over when in fact everyone at this party, they were all millionaires. As a person making $800 a month, as I was at the time, I felt like not only was I not middle class, I was lower class, and I was okay with it at the time, given that I was a graduate student. But it was absolutely amazing to me that these people who were very, very wealthy, in fact, the guy complaining in 1983 that he barely made $1 million in income the previous year because he was getting screwed over by the government and the rich people. And I was thinking to him, you may think you're middle class, but you're really not. So certainly objective and subjective are very, very different. Uh, but where I want to go next is be careful in this course and be careful of one explanation for a whole variety of things because class divisions can be reinforced or they can be buffered by other factors. And I'll use these terms throughout the course, so you may want to kind of be familiar with the polarizing versus cross-cutting cleavages. And I'm going to illustrate this with an international example first, and then I'm going to mention the one that's in your lecture notes, Berkeley and Oakland. If we look at the issue of Northern Ireland, and I will talk about this in a lot more detail when we get to Britain, but the problems of Northern Ireland are almost always seen in terms of religion. We have, I believe, 6 counties in Northern Ireland that are different. Ireland as a whole is Catholic, and you have uh, a Protestant group up in the north, and Catholics feel like they've been persecuted. And in fact, the Catholics claim that Ireland should be united. And of course, the British want to maintain that part of Ireland. And everyone saw that as a battle of two religions. And certainly that was one factor that was creating division in Northern Ireland. But there were other elements, and these would be polarizing, right? In other words, division reinforced division, reinforced division. So, yes, there was a religious split between Catholics and Protestants, but there was a class split in Northern Ireland. The Protestants were much more affluent, much wealthier. The Catholics were much poorer. So you had a religious split that was polarizing the two groups, and that was reinforced by a class split. So upper and middle class Protestants versus poorer Catholics. It was reinforced with ethnicity. So you had Protestants who were largely English, in some cases to a lesser extent Scottish or Welsh, but for the most part English, and the Catholics were Irish. So you had a religious split, you had a economic class split, you had an ethnicity split. There were no cross-cutting cleavages, and by cross-cutting cleavages, you know, are the divisions, are there other things that bind them together? And obviously, uh, you have the two groups at different churches. You have the two groups in many cases going to different schools, different clubs. There was not anything really to bind them together. You can have a significant split and have it work out. And let me give you an example with two cities that you're familiar with. You've probably, hopefully, everyone here has been to both cities. But if you take a look at Berkeley and Oakland, they of course border one another in the East Bay. In fact, there are times where you're not sure you're in Berkeley or you're in Oakland. If you look at 1940, and we're going back 80 years, these were two cities that were overwhelmingly white, to use that phrase. The cities had all white city councils, white mayors. And after World War II, there began to be significant, in fact, it really started during World War II, but it we had what we would call a major demographic shift. That is to say that new immigrants came into both Berkeley and Oakland, to where there was a large black influx in both communities. So you had an ethnic potential cleavage or split. But in Berkeley, this worked out real well. When the black challengers began to challenge white city councilmen, even though you had this race split, the political ideologies of both the black challengers and the white incumbents were both liberal to radical. They agreed on the issues. They both were, for example, pro-free speech. Both were anti-war in Vietnam. They both were really mad at the governor at the time, Governor Reagan, later President Reagan. So even though there was a racial split, politically their agenda and political philosophy was similar. They both were highly educated, so they had that in common. And as a result, the black challengers were accepted into the city council, eventually the mayorship. And so that division was buffered by other factors. So the ethnic division was buffered by they both belonged essentially to similar social classes. They both had similar educations. They both had similar political philosophies. And so those would be cross-cutting cleavages. So Berkeley, at least on that level, was successful. Now, that's not to say that Berkeley didn't have all hell break loose with anti-war protests and a variety of other things in the 1960s and 1970s. But in terms of political challengers, Berkeley was a success story. Now, Oakland's right next door. You have that same division. But it was very, very different. Oakland traditionally was a very conservative, kind of redneck Republican city, certainly in 1940. Certainly none of us today think of Oakland as a conservative, redneck kind of Republican place, but it was the conservative alternative to liberal San Francisco. Oakland, I believe in 1940, the black population was a little over 2%, 2.5%, and I believe by 1980 was 48% black. So when the city began to change and black challengers began running for political office, there were no cross-cutting cleavages like in Berkeley. So you had a situation of black and white challengers, but you had that in Berkeley and it worked out fine. But in Oakland, it didn't work out fine. And the reason was that the white Republican political establishment, very conservative, very property rights oriented, ran into kind of radical leftist black challengers who were more interested in human rights and not property rights. They were Democrats, or in some cases socialist, or a variety of other things. So they had different political agendas, they had different political ideologies. In Berkeley, both the white incumbents and the black challengers were both fairly young. In Oakland, there was an age division. The white political establishment was very old, and the black challengers were young. The white political establishment was very wealthy. The black challengers were of more modest means. And so in that particular case, we have one city, Berkeley, with cross-cutting cleavages. Yes, there was a division by race, but it was buffered by class, it was buffered by political agenda, by age, by a whole variety of factors. In Oakland, the racial division was reinforced by a class division. It was reinforced by political differences in terms of ideology and agenda. And so the result in Oakland was the white political establishment refused to share power with black challengers and said, you're going to have to take it from us. And it created kind of a political civil war in Oakland that was quite bitter. There was a lot of white flight from Oakland. They took their money with them and left the city in pretty bad economic shape for about a decade. Eventually, the black challengers took power. But it was really a very tragic situation because Oakland's a city that in the 1970s I visited a lot, and so I kind of witnessed this Civil War. So you see, it isn't just enough to say, for example, that you have a white political establishment and black challengers. That in and of itself doesn't mean anything, because in Berkeley, the two groups coexisted quite well. In Oakland, the two groups went to war with one another. So you have to ask, well, I need more information. What are the social classes of the challengers and the incumbents? What is the age of the challengers and the incumbents? What is the political philosophy of the challengers and the incumbents? In other words, are there cross-cutting cleavages? Class could be buffered by race, by age, by education. Religion could be buffered by other factors as well. Where you get into real trouble is where factors reinforce one another. The class division is reinforced by religion and by ethnicity and by age and by a whole variety of things. And so even though I tend to agree with Aristotle and Marx and Madison that class is a very important distinction in society, and maybe the most important, in and of itself, that might not be the catalyst for political change. You need to look at, given the context of class, what about other factors that may be significant? Sex, age, religion, hobbies. For example, what if you have a community where both the wealthy and the poor are interested in the environment, for example? That would be a cross-cutting cleavage if they shared an agenda, for example. So in this course, even though we're going to single out and look at specific factors, we put them in a vacuum to analyze them theoretically, but in the real world, you need to understand that any single factor is part of a larger society that we need to examine, and not engage in a notion that one factor is necessarily going to tell you everything. So that's a long-winded way of finishing up the notion of class. We will turn to a new page the next time we meet. We're going to get into this notion of democracy, I believe, in the next page, and I look forward to being here and communicating with you soon. And again, come see me in office hours and let me know what you think of these mini lectures. Have a great day.